The Good Old Grateful Deadcast, the official podcast of the Grateful Dead. I'm Rich Mahan with Jesse Jarnow, exploring the music and legacy of the Grateful Dead for the committed and the curious. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Deadheads, welcome to Season 11 of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast. I'm your co-host, Rich Mahan. Thank you very much for tuning in. In this episode of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast, we continue our tribute to bassist Phil Lesh. We couldn't squeeze everything we wanted to into just one episode, and part two, which you're about to dive into, is itself a nice long look at what made Phil's approach to playing bass and music in general so unique. Hot off the announcement presses are two new Grateful Dead releases headed your way. First up is a massive new Grateful Dead box set, Enjoying the Ride, a limited edition 60 CD, that's 60, box set celebrating the Grateful Dead's 60th anniversary with unreleased performances from 20 legendary venues the band played throughout their career. This one's going fast, folks. If you want a copy, make sure to head to dead.net now and reserve yours. With the exception of a few tracks from earlier releases, virtually all of the music on Enjoying the Ride is previously unreleased, spanning more than 450 tracks and over 60 hours of music. Of the 20 shows in the collection, 17 are presented in full, with some featuring additional material from the same venue. The remaining 3, Fillmore West, Fillmore East, and Boston Music Hall, are curated from multiple performances at each venue, capturing key moments on those legendary stages. This 60 CD box set is limited to only 6,000 individually numbered copies. ALAC and high-res FLAC downloads will also be available on release day, which is May 30th. Enjoying the Ride is available exclusively from dead.net, and you can pre-order your copy today. Also available on May 30th, The Music Never Stopped distills Enjoying the Ride into a shorter route through the band's Diamond Anniversary celebration. Featuring at least one song from every venue in the deluxe set, it offers a briefer but no less illuminating journey through the music that shaped the Grateful Dead's live legacy. It will be available on May 30th from rhino.com on 3 CDs, 6 LPs, or digitally. Make sure to visit dead.net for more info on both of these not-to-be-missed releases. Head on over to dead.net/deadcast and check out all of our past episodes, including the complete seasons 1 through 10. You can link from there to your favorite podcasting platform so you can listen how you like to listen. Please help the Good Old Grateful Deadcast by subscribing, sharing us with your friends on social media, hitting the like button, and leaving us a review. Thank you very much. Hey, we need your stories for the Deadcast. Do you have a great tour story you'd love to share? Well, head over to stories.dead.net and record yourself telling about that epic road trip or the best show you ever saw, and you just may hear yourself on a future episode of the Deadcast. We have transcripts from many of your favorite Deadcast episodes available now for your reading pleasure. Those are available at dead.net/deadcast-index. Check them out. In this episode, part 2 of our tribute to bassist extraordinaire Phil Lesh, we have some very special guests who really help us drill down into what made Phil's approach to playing bass so special and how his unique musicality contributed to making the Grateful Dead's music as unique and timeless as it is. Here's Jesse Jarnow.
Phil Lesh contained multitudes that rearranged themselves molecularly and unceasingly. We'll be using the August 27th, 1972 Playing in the Band as our first casting off point today, and what we'll be hearing from, unless otherwise noted. Here's how Jerry Garcia described Phil to David Gans and Blair Jackson in 1981, now included in David's marvelous book, Conversations with the Dead, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast.
Phil is an incredibly complex guy. He's an incredibly brilliant, incredibly complex guy. And it's like he does things for reasons of his own that are, just like his music, are not easy for me to understand. I mean, I don't know why he is the way he is, or why he does what he does, or what kind of thoughts he thinks, on and off.
In part one of our Philcast tribute, we got into Phil's biography, with a lot of storytelling from Phil himself, and we'll have plenty more of that too. But today, we're going to get into his music and Under the Bass Waves, from the Grateful Dead to Phil and Friends to Terrapin Crossroads. To help us get into Phil Lesh's bass playing, songwriting, and music, please welcome Phil Lesh's bandmate of a dozen years. From Midnight North and the Terrapin Family Band, his son, Grahame Lesh.
When he started Terrapin Crossroads, he would take all of us musicians and we'd have Phil school. He would listen to us rehearse and have pointers. Never play the same thing once.
There was a serious musical philosophy.
Everyone has to be open, but no one person can be too domineering with anything either. The song will lead the way. The music will lead the way.
The pointers at Phil's school could also be a bit zen.
Everything's just in one.
That's a musical concept we'll explore today in a few iterations. This is how Phil described his teaching method to me in 2006.
I try to keep it on a more philosophical basis. I don't want to point out or pick out any player or any situation or any tune that we played last night for intense scrutiny. I just try to suggest ways to look at it and remind musicians that what we really need to do is to listen to one another and play outside of ourselves.
Phil Lesh was an avant-garde musician, often tasked with playing song-based music.
Another bass player, my friend Adam Minkoff, who is one of the smartest people I know about all of this, he was like, yeah, it's crazy. Your dad kind of almost jams out at the beginning of songs and when there's structure. And then at the end, when maybe the recording is going off into a jam and everyone else is starting to blast off, then he starts finding a single motif and just playing that. Do y'all know the Wall song? The Crosby Nash song where my dad and Jerry and Kreutzmann are all on that.
You see a door, such a great open door.
And at the end, they start to jam, and there is a recording where you follow the whole jam. But at least while that is happening, Jerry's starting to play a little more and get a little more out there. And I think the drums are too, but that's when the bass locks into a single motif. It was always unexpected.
It's been said that when you listen to Jerry Garcia transition from singing to playing lead guitar, his personality and expression carry through unbroken. The same continuity can be heard in Phil Lesh.
I feel like he has a very specific melodic sense. To me, I attribute that to, I can hear it because I just know his voice so much because he's my dad. I can kind of hear how he would sing a melody just off the cuff or something like that.
As above, so below, was one of Owsley and the Dead's favorite alchemical precepts, and that applied across all the music made by the musician also known as Reddy Kilowatt, from his improvisation to his songwriting. He could play bass prettily, as we just heard on One from the Vault, and he could sing prettily as well.
What do you want me to do for you, to see you through? For this is all a dream we dreamed one afternoon long ago.
If you've ever tried to learn Box of Rain, it's not so much that the chords are complicated, or even that there are that many of them, but that they keep moving in different ways.
If you lay it out and you look at it as a chart, they do make sense, and you do start to see the thought process. And it's obviously super unique. You do see the patterns. There is a structure and then a superstructure to each of those. And you can kind of see the thought process with all of them, where it's like, oh, this one has this ending, so it goes back to here. And this one has this second ending, so it leads to this other way.
And it's just a box of rain. I don't know who put it there. Believe it if you need it, or leave it if you dare.
In 1970, American Beauty began with Box of Rain, the poignant collaboration between Phil and Robert Hunter, written when Phil's father, Graham's grandfather, Frank Lesh, was dying. We explored it in our American Beauty season, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast. In the studio, the song featured Phil on acoustic guitar, Jerry Garcia on piano and overdub pedal steel, David Nelson on lead guitar, Dave Torbert on bass, and Billy Kreutzmann on drums. They played it that way at the Fillmore East in 1970, but it didn't really enter the band's live repertoire until 1972 and 1973.
Maybe the sun is shining, it's all we can know. Rain is falling from a heavy sky. What do you want me to do for you to see you through? This is all a dream we dreamed one afternoon long ago.
Perhaps not coincidentally, this is when Phil began to start writing songs for the Dead again. Here he is speaking to Andy Childs in 1974.
I didn't write for a very long time, about 3 years, because it wasn't so much that the boys in the band couldn't play what I imagined. It was that it took so long to communicate it.
It's worth reminding that Phil was one of the enthusiastic forces behind the 11, which the Dead started playing in 1967. Bob Weir was fond of writing songs in 7, and there was the main 10, which became playing in the band. New Potato Caboose had a jam in 13. But by the early 70s, the band wasn't practicing the many hours a day when they weren't on tour, that they'd need to really learn some of the thick tunes that Phil was fond of writing.
If I wanted to do a tune that alternated between the 6/4 and 5/4, say just on the level of rhythm, or meter rather, it was real hard for the guys in the band to remember when the changes were going to come. I just sort of gave up trying to do that.
Check out our Unbroken Chain episode to hear how frustrating it was to teach the band that song.
You just simply count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, da 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 D minor.
What's fun about that?
It ain't fun.
But when it came together, it was magnificent. Please welcome back from Phish, Mike Gordon.
There's one time when he had me come and play bass, and I said, well, I love Unbroken Chain. He said, okay, let's do that one. And I said, whoa. We can't do that one just because I have to learn it, and there's a lot going on in there. And little did I know how right I was, because I said, but I will learn it for next time. And there was a next time, and I learned it. I even had Jared, who works for me, help to compose some counterpoint lines and then come up with my own and then just kind of piece it together. And
it worked out pretty well. But there's a song, if there's 6 verses, mini verses, they're all different. As with Box of Rain, like every verse has a slightly different chord progression.
Blue light rain, well, unbroken chain, looking for familiar faces in an empty window pane.
And then the middle parts, there's, the whole section that's in 15, like 7 and 8 back and forth. And it's not just math, so many bands, so many of the jazz fusion bands and artists, it really did sound just like math to me, but not emotion. But with Phil, and as with the Grateful Dead in general, when they got into the proggier sounding stuff, it really felt like it was for emotional purposes, all the mathematical parts.
And like Unbroken Chain, he co-wrote the slightly more straightforward Pride of Cucamonga with Bobby Peterson, which we got into in its own episode last year, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast.
Whoa, Pride of Cucamonga. Whoa, bitter olives in the sun. Whoa, I had me some loving, and I done some time.
With those tunes under their belt, the Dead once again grew comfortable with working in unusual time signatures, and Blues for Allah included Phil's piece King Solomon's Marbles. Certainly, we hope to get back into that in the not-too-distant future. Phil was one of the great instigators of the Far Out in the Grateful Dead, which arguably peaked in 1974. Over the previous few years, the band, and Garcia and Lesh especially, had grown close with the electronic composer, jazz pianist, and MIT-trained biologist Ned Lagin. We've heard Ned's account of how he connected with the Dead in our Nedcast episode. But here's Phil's version, from my conversation with him in 2018.
It's kind of a great story. Ned was studying at MIT. He wrote Grateful Dead a letter about space war and electronic music. And one of the things that he was talking about in this letter, if I remember correctly, was the kind of musical organization of it, this kind of obscure mass by Obrecht, 14th, 15th century. And Miss Maria Zart, I think, is the name of it. He was leading on and on about the construction of it and how intricately linked all of the little motifs were. And it was very intriguing. The next time we played Boston, Ned kind of showed up.
Ned was one of the student organizers of the MIT show in May 1970.
Jerry comes yelling over across the stage after he said, Phil, this is the guy. This is the guy. He the guy who wrote the letter, That's kind of how we met. That first night that we knew each other, we spent all night playing Space War at MIT. Literally the original space on a circular cathode ray tube monitor. I kind of formed a bond with him, and we decided we wanted to do something together. Or he invited me to join him in doing something together.
Not long after Ned relocated to California, the two made preparations to perform Seastones live between Grateful Dead sets.
The closest analog would have been maybe Stockhausen electronic music from the late 50s. He's called Kontakte, or the Gesang der Junglinge, or the Hymnen with all the national anthems. that was one of the most beautiful things about it. It was so completely out of left field.
If the one is where it thinks it is in Grateful Dead jams, someone should maybe do a wellness check during Seastones. That was Ned and Phil performing at the Miami High Lie on June 23, 1974. One of the first of the interlude sets they performed through the Wall of Sound at Dead shows that year. We talked pretty extensively about Seastones during our Nedcast and numerous episodes following the band through 1974 during our Mars Hotel season. Though fraught in some ways, it was a year of high adventure. This is Phil speaking with Andy Childs in September 1974.
I do it all the time. Acid, I mean. All the time. I love it. I love it. I think it's one of the greatest tools.
Are you talking about glass?
No, acid.
Acid, oh yeah.
I think it's one of the greatest tools for learning about yourself, and also you can just use it like it's just like, you know, like it's my quality knob. I turn my when I take a few drops of acid and I turn up my quality knob. Yeah. Yeah. And listening back to it later on a tape, which of course drugs can't have any influence on the tape, I find that generally speaking, the quality is just what I thought it was, especially about what I was playing, about the relationship between what I was playing on the whole band is not always that good because not everybody is always on the same plane, on the same trip.
In Dijon later that week, Ned and Phil had a most excellent adventure, which Ned recounted for us in our Money Money episode, and which we'll repeat here.
After the concert, Phil and I were so up. We were invigorated by the music and the audience, and especially by the chemistry of the moment, that we decided to check out of the motel and drive to Paris that night. We also wanted to separate ourselves from the Drag Racers from Hell movie, as I characterized it at the motel, because Dijon had been such a very nice and interesting and sort of cosmic place. It was decided that it was my turn to be the driver. And so very late at night, we got on the road and I drove at very high speed, maybe, 170, 180 kilometers per hour toward Paris.
We'll once again let the September 18th Seastones soundcheck be our traveling music.
In the middle of what was supposed to be a 6-hour nonstop dark of night run, we started to hear sounds. And it turned out that the tires had heated up so much that the rubber was falling off. We had to get off the highway somewhere in rural France at 3 or 4 in the morning, pitch black. Limping the car along a rural road, we found a country garage and woke up this fellow who did not speak English to get him to replace all the 4 tires. I had 2 years of French in high school, but could only speak a few words of French, like "Where's the bathroom?" And Phil couldn't speak any French at all. Somehow, though, Phil was somehow able to negotiate that transaction because I was at that point only able to do one thing: drive. I couldn't talk. I couldn't get out of the car. I was just driving. The guy. The mechanic jacked up the car on one of those lifts that elevates the entire car with me sitting in the car, my hands on the steering wheel. I was still driving in my head. The mechanic replaced all the tires, lowered the car, and I jetted out of the garage ready to go to Paris. The whole time I had been driving virtually while I was elevated on the lift and was really ready. But we weren't going anywhere until Phil paid the bill. So Phil threw money at the man. I almost didn't get in the car when I zoomed out of there. few hours later, we pulled up to Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was sunrise. It was beautiful. And Phil and I just stood there looking around in happiness and amazement. It was just great. We went over to the Paris Hilton and tried to check in. We were in our cowboy boots, unshaven. And as you know, you could see electric bolts coming out of our heads.
That was from Ned Lagin's Seastones, released by Round Records in 1975, a record that actually had no artist listed on the front cover, or even on the back. On the LP sticker, it's credited to Ned Lagin and Phil Lesh. But that attribution came because during the Dead's year off the road, Jerry Garcia had the Legion of Mary, Bobby Weir had Kingfish, Keith and Donna had the Keith and Donna Band, and from the perspective of Round Records, it'd be nice if Phil Lesh had a project too. Along with Jerry Garcia, he was Ned Lagin's sponsor in the Dead world.
It was a composition that Ned composed. Pretty much had it all laid out, how he wanted it to go, and the sequence of events and so on. The way he mixed it, it was quad that was folded in to stereo, but all kinds of strange spatial things would happen. I remember us playing it for Garcia and Mountain Girl over at their place in Stinson Beach. And there's this one part where there's lots of low frequency glissando type stuff. MG gets up and looks out the window and she says, "I thought I heard a tank." In a nutshell, to me, is kind of Ned's way of expressing or his kind of aesthetic, so that you don't know what you're hearing, but it reminds you maybe of something, and it'll, of course, remind different people of different things.
Seastones included an all-star cast, including David Crosby.
It was such a gas to see Crosby jumping in on something like that.
And we'll let Crosby be our segue point. Phil Lesh didn't join up with projects outside the Dead too often, but David Crosby was one of them, playing bass on numerous tracks on Cros's classic 1970 album, If I Could Only Remember My Name.
I thought I met a man who said he knew a man who knew what was going on. I was mistaken.
They even briefly formed a quartet featuring Crosby, Garcia, Lesh, and Kreutzmann.
David and the Dorks or Jerry and the Jerks, depending on who got to the microphone first. If we'd gotten to do it more, it could have been really good.
That was David Crosby, of course. For lots more about the so-called Planet Earth Rock and Roll Orchestra, check our Addicts of My Life episode. Cros and Lesh stayed friendly over the years. When we spoke with David in 2021, they'd just hung out.
Do you guys know that I had lunch with Phil Lesh yesterday?
The Lesh would occasionally sit in with other bands over the years. The amount of artists he recorded with outside the Dead's immediate circle could be counted on Jerry Garcia's right hand. He appeared on Graham Nash's Songs for Beginners.
I used to be a king, and everything around me turned to rust. It's 'cause I built my life on sand, and I watched it crumble in the dust.
We're going to zoom in on one of Phil Lesh's side jams, though it might not sound like that at first.
They love each other. Lord, you can see that it's true. Lord, you can see that it's true. Lord, you can see that it's true.
That's from Jerry Garcia's Reflections, where the Dead backed him on half the album. In 1981, Garcia told Musician magazine this story. Phil played on 4 songs for a solo album of mine called Reflections, Now, I write pretty conventionally structured songs, so I asked Phil to play basically the same lines on each chorus so I could anchor it in the bass. But I didn't really see the beauty of what he'd done till later, when I was running off copies of the tape at fast forward. The bass was brought up to a nice skipping tempo, right in that mellow mid-range guitar tone, and I was struck by the amazing beauty of his bass line. There was this wonderful syncopation and beautiful harmonic ideas that were barely perceptible at regular speed, but when it's brought up to twice the speed, God, it just blew me out. I'm not sure which song Garcia is referring to specifically, but if you have any ideas, feel free to chime in on the episode page at dead.net/deadcast. I'm going to propose they love each other. And being a member of the Dead and all, alongside his own singular bass style, Phil Lesh explored the world of boutique basses. First, Alembic modified Phil's Guild Starfire into the instrument known as Big Brown, which hit the stage in its custom form in the summer of 1971, giving Lesh the warm, punchy sound that defined the band in 1971 and 1972 especially. And now let's isolate Big Brown. Grahame Lesh.
It's always melodic, and it's always not exactly in the rhythmic place that you think, but it is so perfectly groovy and funky at the same time. And it's always like playing off of what you maybe expect a traditional bass sound to play, like where the notes should be almost.
Last episode, Mike Gordon from Phish told us something in almost exactly the same terms, which we're going to repeat for emphasis before we start getting into the specifics of Phil's bass playing.
It's almost like a conjuring trick of magic to be able to imply the chords and the rhythm and all these things without playing them, by weaving in and out of them. I'm going to be melodic and I'm going to be a powerhouse of solidness. That's the way that I perceived it. And it doesn't even seem humanly possible.
In our last episode, Mike told us about how, early in his career, he avoided studying Phil Lesh's bass lines too closely for fear of sounding too much like him.
It was going to rub off on me anyway, and if I was going to keep any originality to my own playing, I would have to avoid it until I started playing with Grateful Dead members. And then I thought, okay, now I got to take the deep dive and see what's in there. Often it ended up being surprising. And so I've spent the whole week learning these songs like I had never before. I'd played some of them before, but I never really listened to see what the hell was going on. And I was pretty blown away. In some cases, I wrote lines down in musical notation. I think that's when I really, really learned that he's not playing the pattern, not playing the riff from the song and weaving in between so much of the time. I was really pretty blown away. It took me a while to realize, like, let's say that lick at the end of Scarlet Before Fire, that everyone's doing the lick, and he doesn't even do like one note of that lick. And I think it took me years to even realize that, to really, that's pretty incredible to avoid.
That was from May 25th, 1977, Dave's Picks 1. Like every member of the Dead, Phil Lesh's playing evolved over the years. There's a somewhat reductionist way to compare Phil's playing in the earlier eras versus the 80s and 90s, to go under the waves of Phil's vibrations. And to get down with that a little bit more, please welcome to the Deadcast, Rob Collier, who teaches music history and theory at Alverno College in Wisconsin.
It seemed like in the 70s, he would avoid playing unison figures with the band at all cost. Like, no matter what, even something as simple as like the hits before the chorus of Eyes of the World. Basically, the whole band goes ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, and sort of drops into the chorus. Phil will not play that. Like, he will play anything but that.
Just carry the bird away. Wake up to find out that you are the eyes of the world.
That's August 13th, 1975.
In the 80s and 90s, he plays those figures with the band. He plays those hits with the band.
Wake up to find out that you are the eyes of the world.
So it's like sort of little moments like that, but then also bigger moments like Slipknot. In late 80s and 90s, he's kind of playing those like intricate arpeggio figures with Jerry. In the 70s, absolutely not. Sort of playing these weird syncopated figures against those lines. I tend to hear his playing as like he's thinking counterpoint, like he's providing not just like support for Jerry's lead lines, but like a counter melody to Jerry's lead lines.
Mike Gordon.
That really makes sense that it would come out of his classical training, even if it wasn't a complete and thorough classical training and sensibility to think about counterpoint in that way.
Rather than sounding like a jazz bass player, he sounds like a jazz trumpet or a jazz sax player. Like his lines have more of that kind of like soloistic feel rather than the sort of walking line.
We'll head back to the Veneta 72 version of playing in the band now.
Playing in the band, Phil's bass line, I think of it as having like two melodic motions. It starts with this kind of root, fifth, sixth root motion, root, 5, 6, root. This to me is like a Motown groove. He plays essentially that in playing in the band from the 70s through the 90s. It's not always that verbatim. That as an element is kind of always in there somehow. And then the other motion in the 70s, it was a motion from F sharp up to A. That was kind of the ending motion for the bass line. And how he got from F sharp to A would change. And in 71 and 72, he kind of sticks to that basic groove in a lot of performances of playing in the band. It's probably never like verbatim the same. There is often that kind of start with that sort of Motown groove and then make that motion so that he can end on the A and then get back to the top of the pattern.
By the 80s, the approach had changed. This is from Madison Square Garden in 1982 on In and Out of the Garden.
Some folks trust reason, others trust your might. I don't trust nothing, but I know it come out right. See it once again now. Well, I hope you understand. When it's done over, Lord, man, it's just...
The 82 version, that little Motown figure, is kind of there, but it's so obscured. You can sort of pick it out, like I can pick it out just because I notated it, and I can sort of see that it's there in almost every measure. But listening to it, you probably wouldn't recognize it as like, oh yeah, this is the same kind of groove.
Now some folks look for answers, others look for fights. Some folks up in treetops, just looking for their kites. And I can tell you future, oh, look what's in your hand. But I can't stop for nothing, I'm just playing in the band.
Mike Gordon.
I got invited to be on some kind of a chat or something like that, where everyone just got to ask Phil some questions. And the one that they used was very technical. And this was my question. And so you can hear him asking it. He said, this is from the bass player of Phish. And then he just laughs. And the question is, do you feel like you were the one who, let's say, spearheaded the idea of playing an upper octave on the downbeat and then the lower octave a few beats later and the next beat, rather than the way most bass players do by playing a lower octave and then an upper octave? So first he just laughs, like, because all of the other questions were nothing like that. And then his answer was, okay, well, I'll answer. My answer is the person that came up with that, as far as I know, is Bach. And so there's a lot of years that's already been happening before I did it. And that was my answer.
To return to the Veneta version of Playing in the Band, though, Rob just called out two moments in the jam that speak to the way Phil thought as a bassist within the Dead, rhythmically and harmonically.
He starts on an E, sort of a high, maybe tenor register E, and then sort of walks down, mostly down the scale, E, D, C, A to G, and then sort of does a little kind of turnaround, and then does that, gets back up to the E, kind of walks down again. He plays this figure 4 times, and it kind of starts the same every time, but it's a different length, like rhythmically or metrically each time. So I like counted it out. The first time he plays this pattern, it's 25 16th notes long, right? Like there, he's not playing exclusively in 16th notes, but like that's the length, is 25, the length of 25 16th notes. You could notate it in a measure, a bar of 25/16, which is not a super common time signature. The next time it's 26 16th notes. He repeats it again, but it's 23 16th notes long. He repeats it again, but it's 27 16th notes long.
This is an example of the eternal Grateful Dead rhythmic philosophy. The one is where it thinks it is.
One of the cool things about the Playing in the Band jam, they're all locked into a pulse, but they have basically abandoned a time signature. Like they're not playing in 4/4. They've left that 10/4 kind of grouping behind. Basically, every band member sort of invents their own time signature. They can kind of play in whatever they want as long as they're locked into this kind of, like that pulse is always there. other moment is kind of similar, except instead of a descending line, he plays an ascending line. And he kind of starts on D, moves up to E, moves up to F, moves up to G, moves up to A, and then drops back down to D to start this ascent again. But again, he can play in whatever meter, whatever time signature he wants. You listen to it and you recognize, like, yeah, he's playing this kind of ascending figure. It's slow enough, kind of like he's ascending slowly enough that it's easy to hear him ascend and then kind of drop back down to restart. Makes no attempt to conform to any kind of regular meter. He can take as much time as he wants getting from the starting point to the top of this ascent before dropping back down. Before Phil was a bass player, he was an experimental composer, and a lot of that sort of mid-century classical music, modern classical music, it incorporated elements of noise, like non-traditional musical elements. So even if you were playing a piano, for instance, like John Cage had his prepared piano, so he wanted that piano to not sound like a piano, where it put all of these objects in the belly of the piano to create all of these different timbres.
This is another part of Phil Lesh's bass voice that might be considered. In the 50s and 60s, classical and jazz musicians began exploring what are called extended techniques, creating sounds from their instrument beyond the scales and chords implied by its construction. Here's Lesh in Cincinnati on December 4th, 1973, coaxing some extended tones from Big Brown's complex of knobs. In June of 1974, Phil switched over to his first fully custom bass, made by Alembic and officially known as Osiris, though nicknamed Mission Control by fans because of its enormous field of knobs. Designed to be a quadraphonic part of the wall of sound, we discussed Mission Control at length in our Loose Lucy episode last year, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast. Though the quad bass was legendary when deployed, it didn't happen that often. Here's how Phil described it to me when I interviewed him in 2018.
I never really used it as much as I could have. The problem was that if I'm playing on one string and then the next string, the one string would come out across over by Jerry, and then the other one would come out behind me. And so the other guys in the band wouldn't be able to really understand what I was playing. It may have been a problem all along anyway.
Phil often said that this one-drummer period, from 1971 to 1974, were his favorite years of Grateful Dead music, and it's easy to hear why. Besides Pigpen, everybody was relatively healthy, and the bass was often front and center in the band's dynamic, and Phil's vocals a regular part of the mix. I love his high harmony on Jackstraw.
We can share the women, we can share the wine. share what we got of yours, 'cause we done shared all of mine.
But the late 1970s and early 1980s were a rough time for Lesh.
I started out on Heineken, but I soon hit the hardest stuff. All my friends, they swore they'd stand beside me when the game got rough.
He took the band's road hiatus especially hard, a topic he addresses in Searching for the Sound.
As I was to discover, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. It's very difficult at this distance in time to analyze the motivation for my conduct in the next few years. It may be that I was feeling some degree of isolation after 10 years of complete immersion in the band and its music. Thus began my descent into alcoholism.
We've linked to the audiobook at dead.net/deadcast. There was a lot of bad behavior and a brief, regrettable marriage. Later, Phil would refer to this period as the Heineken years. His presence inside the Dead seemed to diminish. For starters, when the band returned to the road in 1976, Phil no longer had a vocal microphone. Here's how Bob Weir described it to David Gans in 1977.
Yeah, he blew his voice. Singing, improper singing technique. He could get it back with an operation, but it's an expensive operation. And then after that, you can't talk, you can't whisper or anything for 6 weeks. Wow. And then you come back very slowly.
He was still writing songs, though. In 1977, Phil co-wrote Passenger with Peter Monk, an answer song to Fleetwood Mac's Station Man, sung on Terrapin Station by Bobby Weir and Donna Godchaux. And during the Terrapin sessions as well, the band recorded the song Equinox, now on the Beyond Description box and the expanded Terrapin Station. Though it was sung by Jerry Garcia, the music was by Phil, with lyrics again by Peter Monk, who wrote the words for Passenger.
That said, it's bound to rise. Night birds and fireflies settle around her.
It's a big bummer it disappeared so quickly. We mentioned Phil's infinitely changing multitudes earlier, and it's a trait Jerry Garcia recognized intimately. This is Garcia speaking with David Gans and Blair Jackson in 1981 from Conversations with the Dead, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast.
His periods of being enthusiastic and being an estrangement, which we all have about the we're all ambivalent about the Grateful Dead, you know what I mean? It's like it gets to be a love-hate thing after a while. That he goes through those changes with greater frequency. Sometimes during the course of a gig, he'll go through 2 or 3 great big changes. You know? Mm-hmm. And that he's like much harder on himself than anybody is on him. He's like he punishes himself in his own mental being, or his own artistic space or whatever it is.
But in the 1980s, Phil's role did seem to diminish. Gary Lambert.
I thought of the Grateful Dead in terms of breakthroughs and plateaus. And I think things plateaued for Phil maybe earlier than they did for some. And maybe as the band became more competent, they also took on less risk. It made them a better, more disciplined band in a lot of ways. But yes, there's always a trade-off there. And I think Phil may have been more keenly aware of that trade-off.
In 1982, the Dead rearranged themselves on stage for the first time in a few years, putting Jerry Garcia on the right side, stage left, and Phil Lesh on the opposite, stage right, or left for the audience. David Gans discussed it with Phil not long after it happened.
You might have noticed by the time we got to the Greek that I'd move over next to Billy.
In a band with 2 drummers, the bassist was having trouble hearing the kick drum, so moved himself closer to Billy Kreutzmann. There's a reason Kreutzmann was nicknamed Bill the Drummer, and not Bill a Drummer.
We had a band meeting early this year, and I said, look, I want to be next to Billy. And Jerry finally said, I'll try to play with you. Yeah, I guess you just push for something for 5 years or more. And you finally get.
You guys are pretty much not into confrontations, are you?
It's totally useless. It's never been fruitful. It's never worked for us.
Perhaps the thing that reawakened Phil Lesh, and certainly made him more audible within the Grateful Dead, was his switch from 4-string to 6-string bass, debuted during the very last shows of 1982. We'll soundtrack this next segment with the Bird Song from October 11th, 1983, now on In and Out of the Garden. The Modulus 6-string bass was virtually invented for him by Jeff Gould. Rob Collier.
I don't think his playing fundamentally changed. You do get a few extra notes on the bottom and on the top, but more than that, it sort of allows you to play like across the neck instead of like so much up and down. He wouldn't have to shift to get those higher notes. He can kind of keep his hand in the same position to get the higher notes or to get the lower notes.
Mike Gordon.
I started to learn, maybe he told me, and maybe I just noticed that he kept his hands in a similar part of the neck, often around the 7th fret, which is basically about halfway between the nut and, not the bridge, but maybe the end of the fingerboard. Most bass players, even if they have a low string, 5-string bass, and they want to play a low E, they're going to play at the lowest string on a 4-string bass is E. So they would just play that open with no fingers. But Phil would never do that. He always, or usually wouldn't do it. He would play the B string 5 frets up. So what that means a couple of things. First of all, he has to fret the note. It's not open. And by having to fret it, that means you can let go really quickly and have a shorter note. More control, because there's more ways to shorten the note. You can put your palm on with your right hand, but you can also let go really quickly with your left hand by using a fretted note. The other thing is it puts my hand closer to that 7th position because it's the 5th fret. So some of my fingers, if I'm playing with my index finger, some of my fingers are right over that 7th fret. And what happens is by sticking to that same part of the neck, it makes the tone consistent. The weird thing about guitars and basses as compared to pianos is there's a lot of ways to play the same note. But the more you go up the neck toward the pickups, the rounder and less defined the note sounds. And the more you go down the neck toward the nut and the end of the strings, the tuning heads, the more cutting it is. But by forcing yourself to stay in the middle of the neck like that, the amount from roundness to cutting stays more consistent. And then you can start to dial it in to be punchy and to sound like you want. There's still going to be choices. Still going to be different from string to string and fret to fret. But this consistency thing is incredible.
Though Phil Lesh started singing occasional backup vocals on Truckin' starting in 1977, he didn't get a vocal mic again until 1984. It resulted in the beginning of chants for We Want Phil. Here's Garcia responding to one such chant at the Frost Amphitheater in 1985, now on Dave's Picks 49.
We're hanging on to him for a while.
But they did, in fact, let Phil sing. Here, doing his version of Bob Dylan's Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, with some of his own lyrics.
Well, if you succeed in it, please tell her thanks a lot. My stalks still twisted, my tentacles are all in and out. I don't even have the strength, but take another shot. And my best friend, my drummer, won't even tell me what it was that I dropped.
In 1986, there was a new Phil Lesh song to celebrate for the first time in almost a decade.
Poets, suckers, and Godzilla's grandmother, sweet little frozen nose soup. We got Speed Racer and his arcade android, revolutionary hamstrung blues.
Revolutionary Hamstrung Blues was co-written once again with lyricist Bobby Peterson, this time with additional music by Brent Midland. The Dead played it only once, and the song disappeared from the band's orbit probably around the time of Jerry Garcia's diabetic coma that summer, gone entirely by the time the band finished up In the Dark the next year. But by the late 1980s, Phil Lesh was committed to the Dead again. Around the time In the Dark came out, Phil threw himself into another wide-scale project as a serious big-eared patron of the arts, Gary Lambert.
This was right after Jerry had come out of the coma and the band was revitalized. They gave permission for KPFA to broadcast their New Year's Eve show from Henry J. Kaiser. And I got to co-host that, and they also gave me some production responsibilities, one of which was to figure out a way to fill up the break between sets. And I said, why don't we let the Grateful Dead program the music for the break? And so I reached out to each band member and said, if you could pick one or two short tunes that we could play during the break, what would they be? And of course, being the Grateful Dead, they came up with this entertainingly eclectic list of stuff, from a Duke Ellington, Frank Sinatra duet to Garcia, I think, specifically trying to trip me up by naming a 16th century Italian Renaissance Christmas carol to, but I found it, and something called Riu Riu Chiu.
Dios guardó el lobo de nuestra cordera. Dios guardó el lobo de nuestra cordera.
And then when I asked Phil, he just said, well, you couldn't play what I want to play at the break because it's an hour-long symphony by a dead British composer named Havergal Bryan. It's kind of a so there, you know? I said, okay, what can you do? I gave it my best shot. But a few weeks after New Year's Eve, I decided to call Phil's bluff. And I sent him a note and said, listen, you're very well liked at KPFA. You have history there. So I'm sure if you ever wanted to come in and play that symphony by Havergal Bryan and talk about it, you'd be welcome. And Phil said, oh, that's a good idea. And I said, maybe we could even do it more than once. And then Phil said, why don't we just turn it into a regular show?
You're listening to KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno. Stay tuned now for Rex Radio.
Basically, it was Phil and I getting to talk about music. The show was mostly music, but we would do an introduction and give a little background.
Good evening and welcome to Rex Radio. I'm Gary Lambert, and we're back for yet another month with dispatches from the far frontiers of musical experience. We have about 54 minutes of music to cram into a 1-hour slot.
Except for one show, we had a 59-minute piece by Cecil Taylor. The show was an hour. So Phil just came on and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Cecil Taylor." And then Cecil just has at the piano for 59 minutes.
That was from Cecil Taylor's Silver Tongues. Phil was a fun DJ.
Tonight's music is the music, we might say, of synesthesia, music that goes beyond the oral medium to speak in an almost visual language.
This was in the period when Phil had really ramped up his support of experimental, improvised and composed music through the Rex Foundation. He was really generating a lot of grants and things like the Ralph J. Gleason Award and all of that for people who really lived on the musical fringes and really had no other means of getting their music played or recorded or performed or any of that. And there's an excellent documentary about that called The Grateful and the Dead, which I recommend.
For several years, composers or their families in many parts of Britain have been secretly supported by an infamous American rock band about which most of them knew nothing. They had no idea who were behind the funds that flowed from the mysterious Rex Foundation of San Francisco.
Founded in 1983 and named after the late roadie Rex Jackson, the Rex Foundation's Angel Grants became an unexpected force in underground music and art starting in the 1980s, providing supportive funds for a range of creators, from alchemical filmmaker Harry Smith to harmonic sax titan Ornette Coleman, and, via Phil Lesh's sponsorship, a range of contemporary classical composers.
The composers were just flabbergasted. First of all, they'd get these checks for $10,000 from the Rex Foundation, which they had never heard of, especially the ones in Britain.
What I wanted to do when I tried to interest the Rex Foundation in supporting this music was I wanted to bring this music to an audience so that others could enjoy it as I had. I would say if there is a unifying factor of all these composers, it's the fact that they're all outsiders. None of them are part of what you might call a musical establishment.
So we originally created the show as a vehicle for that. It was originally called Rex Radio. We started in June of 1987 and played a lot of wonderful, very obscure music, very eclectic music.
Eventually, they changed the name of the show to Eyes of Chaos, Veil of Order, running on KPFA from 1988 through 1994. We've posted a link to their old playlist at dead.net/deadcast. They were part of the local outsider musical community, too.
And now, a little new feature that we have here, the Rex Foundation Radio Date Book. January 17th at Jazz in Flight Gallery at 333 Dolores Street, the Hieroglyphic Ensemble with Peter Apfelbaum. They're going to do 2 sets. That's a avant-garde big band. On February 5th and 6th in Berkeley, the Berkeley Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Kent Nagano, is going to be doing Maxwell Davies Symphony No. 2, which is a very important piece, I think. I'm definitely going to be there to hear that.
He got turned on to some of the new stuff coming out of New York, coming out of the Knitting Factory and the downtown jazz scene. And he became a big fan of David Murray, for example. And that's how David Murray kind of got ushered into the Grateful Dead scene. When Phil would come to New York, on a day off between Dead shows at the Garden, he'd go see Anthony Braxton at the Knitting Factory. We did that together. Twice on consecutive years, McCoy Tyner's yearly residency at the club called Sweet Basil occurred during a Dead Garden run. And Phil and I hopped in the car right after a Dead show and went down to catch McCoy's late set. One year with Brent, and then sadly the next year Brent was gone, and the next year it was with Bruce and Vince. And seeing these keyboardists just like with jaws dropping, watching McCoy play was really a glorious thing to behold. He seemed in really good spirits and really engaged during that whole 8 years we were doing the radio show.
Like his bandmates, Phil Lesh embraced the MIDI rig on his instrument. On the title track of Infrared Roses, he's credited with MIDI trombone, French horn, strings, and bells. The band's music was hardly static as the 90s unfolded, and Lesh was very much a part of it. Though they'd never make it to a Dead album, between 1992 and 1994, Lesh debuted 3 new original songs, Wave to the Wind, If the Shoe Fits, and Childhood's End, his most productive songwriting period since maybe ever.
River runs deep, river runs slow, get a little restless, wanna see some waves flow. River runs cold, river runs clean, truth always gets to me, round about this time of year.
That was Childhood's End, which will get its first official release this year on the forthcoming Enjoying the Ride box set, recorded October 3rd, 1994 at Boston Garden. David Lemieux spoke with Phil about it quite some time ago.
I'm talking 20 years ago. And I said, hey, you have this big flurry of new songs, 3 new songs at the in the 90s. And he said he just was feeling very inspired again to write songs again. I remember him telling me, he said the one song he wished had developed more and was Childhood's End. So I'm happy to have that to be the one that's on here. It's such a good song.
Reach behind the wind, search beyond the stars, hear the light on mine.
It's very different from anything. That's the thing. I think everything Phil ever did was very different from anything Phil ever did.
This is true. There's a reason rivers are one of the eternal Grateful Dead images, never the same for even a second. The Grateful Dead's music in the 1990s is sometimes obscured by the decline in Jerry Garcia's health, and it's easy to forget that the other musicians on stage continued their own singular evolutions. Mike Gordon.
There was a time when, in the early 90s, when I was able to get a little bit in the inner circle at a few Dead shows. Once or twice, they put me on stage on the side with a monitor person, and they had this really nice thing for people sitting there where they could push buttons and hear what each band member was hearing in their in-ear monitor mix. So there were 6 buttons, and then there was a 7th button, and you could just solo anything you wanted, and they would just assign it to that 7th button. So guess what I picked? Just use your imagination. One thing I noticed when I was doing that on the stage, probably between 93 and 95, is that he really was sometimes repeating patterns. It wasn't as void of pattern as he preaches, but it's unhinged, where someone else would just do it the whole song. Even then, it's going to be the way the notes are approached. It's likely to be in between everything. It's really a redefining moment. And some band members had trouble with it because it was unpredictable. It wasn't as solid, but more than the complaints is a holy fuck. This is so unique. And so to be able to not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
When Mike allowed himself to study Phil Lesh's bass playing, he got really into it. For many years, he played a Modulus bass, an instrument designed with Phil in mind, and rebuilt his own bass rig several times, trying what Phil tried.
It's actually embarrassing, but yes, more than once. I think I modeled at least 3 different Meyer systems, always a few years late. Like when he had moved on to the next one, I was on to the previous one. So end of the 90s might have started with, these were 18-inch speakers. I think there were a total of 4 18s and 2 15s and some horns, and unpowered, so requiring separate power amps. And then another system when they started to have powered. The big speaker with 2 18s each, those are meant to be subs and really just carry the deepest frequencies for concerts or, movie theaters or whatever. So they would cross over at 80 hertz. So that would mean that only halfway up the bass neck with the fundamental tone actually move those speakers at all. So he had one of those gigantic boxes altered so that the crossover would allow it to go up to 500 hertz. And what that meant was every note on the bass and then some was going to move the air of those speakers on that one side. And that model is called the PL, 650 PL, the 750 PL, because for Phil Lesh.
That was from the Capitol Center in spring 1993, from the forthcoming Enjoying the Ride box, maybe around the time Mike is discussing.
So I started copying everything. I mean, there was the shit on record, and some of it is compression and tube amps and things like that. But the stuff live was really blowing me away. First being up front and then being able to be closer. And so I just started shamelessly copying it. And it wasn't just the speakers and the EQ and the preamp, all that. It was also the pick that he used and the strings. I think the strings that I ended up using for many years, he had just dabbled in a little. The Kid Candelario was his bass tech for a while. And he was saying, okay, these strings, this pick, and I was copying. And by the time I ended up playing with Phil and he was checking out my strings, he's like, what the hell are those? He had only used them for a little bit. And they're halfway between flat and round. Early on, bass players that used a pick used flatter strings sometimes because the round wound strings that are typical would be kind of grungy sounding with the pick. But later on, and that included Phil, but later on, he always liked round wound strings. And when I talked to him, he just said, I need to hear the upper harmonics. I'm losing my hearing a bit. I want to hear the grunge and the sizzle. So I need to use round wounds. And so I started to develop my own path. I mean, now I'd switched to Seric basses, and I gradually developed my own thing in various ways, had other influences woven in, but none as big as Phil.
After marrying Jill Johnstone in 1984, the two had their first son, Grahame, in 1986, and Brian a few years later. From very early on, they were regulars at Bay Area Dead shows.
My brother and I heard a lot of first sets in the Grateful Dead. In the 8 years that I was alive while the Grateful Dead was going, Jerry died when I was 8. We would go to a lot of first sets and then, go back and go to sleep because we were little kids.
But they also went on the road.
My folks traveled as a family unit. It would just be us adjacent to all this craziness, I think, to a little bit more of an extent than maybe before my brother and I were born. And we would go to museums and do all kinds of family stuff, kind of in addition to the crazy tour, rock and roll lifestyle.
Grahame and Brian had an impact on two of the band's more memorable onstage activities during their last years on the road.
We were super young, but they hired some guy to come as Barney to entertain the kids in the kids' room backstage.
I love you, you love me, we're a happy
When the Dead took the stage for the second set at Nassau Coliseum on April 1st, 1993, at stage right was a giant purple dinosaur playing a Modulus bass. Jerry Garcia did a double take.
It was not my dad in the costume. It was my dad behind the road cases when the guy just like dancing out in front of the crowd. I think they got a cease and desist from whoever owned the rights to the images to Barney the dinosaur, which I think is a fun coda to that story.
Grahame was starting to learn the Grateful Dead's music, too.
I was probably around so much Grateful Dead that I definitely remember, like, as a little kid, the working man's American Beauty stuff was really, it's kind of kid-friendly, the more countryish stuff.
Come here, Uncle John's band by the riverside. Got some things to talk about here beside the rising tide. Come here, Uncle John's band playing to the tide. Come on along and go alone. He's come to take his children home.
It was the Mars Hotel record. We just listened to that. I like remember driving around when I was a kid and it being pointed out that that was the bass. Like I could tell that that was my dad singing.
Willow sky, whoa, I walk and wonder why. They say love your brother, but you will catch it when you try.
But obviously, I really liked Unbroken Chain. That was my dad's song. And it's I don't know, to a kid, it doesn't sound as complicated as maybe it does to someone who has a music education at that point. It was told to me that the band didn't play it. They'd never played the whole song. They put it together in the studio. And that just kind of blew my mind. I was like, well, but like, why? And I think me just like being a kid being like, but why though, is what kind of triggered that. So as a little kid, I think that is what put the bug in my dad's ear to finally play it.
Which they did in March 1995. Thanks, Grahame. David Lemieux.
I still listen to the audience tape of the breakout in Philadelphia, and I get goosebumps listening to it because they end the first set with a typical first set closer, and then they don't walk off stage, and then they go into it, and you're like, oh, what's this little thing? And and then when people pick up on the chord progression, and then Phil starts singing, it's like I'm goosebumps talking about it.
As he got older, Grahame would learn a lot more about what made Unbroken Chain such an achievement, though not because he set out to particularly.
I think I started taking piano lessons when I was 7 or 8, somewhere around there. The main backdrop of taking piano lessons, taking music theory, all of that, which really was like for both of my parents, like, hey, you should do this because it's part of a full education, not because we want you to be a musician, not for any other reason than it's like taking math class or something, or English, like you should know this. And that was the case for both my brother and I. And I think that's a really wise way of thinking about music education.
Even though Graham's dad was Phil Lesh, there will eternally be some things parents just don't understand.
When I was a teenager, I got into all kinds of hip hop and metal and grunge for sure. I loved Audioslave and Soundgarden. My dad told this story at my wedding, actually. I was listening to Metallica really loud, and he made some comment about that ungodly noise or something like that. I came back, snooty little teenager that I was, and said, yeah, maybe to the untrained ear. I feel like he would have enjoyed some of the technical compositions of a lot of that stuff if he had gotten past the gunshot snare drums and, the volume.
In fact, Phil did cover Metallica once with the 2004 band that toured as The Dead, featuring Bobby Weir and the drummers, alongside Jeff Chimenti, Jimmy Herring, and Warren Haynes, who sang this version of Nothing Else Matters. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. In some ways, Phil Lesh was just gearing up during the final years of the Grateful Dead. Fall 1994 had seen the first gig billed officially as Phil Lesh and Friends at the Berkeley Community Theater, adjacent to Phil's alma mater, Berkeley High, where his friends for the night were Jerry Garcia, Bob Weir, and Vince Welnick.
River run deep, river run slow, get a little restless, wanna see some waves go. River run cold, river run clear, feeling always gets to me, round about this time of year.
The first Phil and Friends gig didn't exactly establish a template for what Phil Lesh would do with the rest of his career, but it also did. In the years immediately following Jerry Garcia's departure, Lesh was reluctant to return to the stage, urged back in part by our friend David Gans, and eventually reuniting with his bandmates for the first Other Ones tour in 1998, releasing the live album, The Strange Remain, and cementing Phil's long reconnection with the lost corners of the Dead songbook.
Old mountain water, the jade merchant's daughter, mountains of the moon, electric bow and bend to me. I hold the carrion crow, rowdy, rowdy, riddle. I hold the carrion crow, bow and bend to me.
In those years, it was reported that Lesh was creating an orchestral work based on Grateful Dead music. When I spoke with Phil in 2006, he had this to say.
I worked on that for almost a couple of years. That was during a period where I was more or less retired, right after Gary died. I made 50 pages of sketches, and some of it very detailed for orchestra. And what I was looking for was closure with Grateful Dead music in a way, so I could maybe move on to something else. The thing that I discovered, there's no such thing as closure with the music. The music demands to constantly be evolving. So if I was to write it down in my version of it, to write it all down, that would fix it for all time in my version of it. But that wouldn't be satisfying because the nature of music is to continually evolve. So I pretty much abandoned that.
In 1998, the world changed for Phil when he received a life-saving liver transplant, the result of hepatitis C, acquired during his brief bad period as a needle-sharing speed freak in the mid-'60s before joining the Warlocks. From then on, all of Phil Lesh's live performances, in every configuration, included what Tapers quickly labeled the donor rap, a permanent part of the setlist. This one is from Radio City Music Hall, March 2nd, 2018.
I'm a liver transplant survivor, and I'm lucky to be alive at all. Much less have spent the last 20 years watching my sons grow up, meeting my grandson, playing lots of music with great people. That never would have happened if it hadn't been for Cody, who decided to be an organ donor kind of spontaneously one day. And he just told his mom, "Hey man, if anything ever happens to me, I want to be an organ donor." And so I like to encourage everyone that I meet and every audience that I perform in front of to join me in honoring his courage, his generosity of spirit, simply by turning to someone that you love and that loves you, and you tell them, hey, if anything ever happens to me, I want to be an organ donor. I mean, you could actually do it right now if you have that person next to you.
Thanks, Cody. In 1999, Phil Lesh began what might be described as his second act, or maybe his third act. But whatever it was, his quarter-century leading Phil Lesh and Friends lineups lasted almost as long as his time in the Grateful Dead itself. That was the classic Phil and Friends lineup from the Warfield in 1999, featuring guitarist Steve Kimmock, drummer John Molo, and from Phish, guitarist Trey Anastasio and pianist Paige McConnell. Phil soon convened what became known as the Quintet, a band featuring guitarists Warren Haynes and Jimmy Herring, drummer John Molo, and keyboardist Rob Baracco. They recorded a studio album in 2002 with new songs by Phil and Robert Hunter, There and Back Again.
Long years rolling homeward bound, hell for leather on this merry-go-round. Night of 1,000 stars, the sound of sweet guitars. On this night, 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 on this night of 1,000 stars.
And alongside There and Back Again, released in 2002, was a new batch of material called the Planet Jams, written for a never-staged concert spectacle that, in a way, constitutes something of a lost album.
He wrote all these Planet Jams. I think they played each one once. They performed all of them, and Candace Brightman made this amazing For Each Planet backdrop. And that was the only hint that they were doing anything unique. They were just these pieces of music that sounded like jams. They weren't jams, they were composed. And they're really cool. He called it the Entrada Jam. It was like the entrance music for this journey through the cosmos. They would play it in whatever key was going to lead to the planet that came after. He and Hunter were going to work on this, and Hunter wrote lyrics for all these planets. And it was supposed to be the jams would go into the songs, also in that mode. They never finished it. I encourage anyone to go track down the Planet Jams.
We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast.
I wrote the song to the lyrics that Hunter wrote for Jupiter, yes. And my friend Alex Coford from the Terrapin Family Band wrote an amazing song to Mercury that we play sometimes. But, you know, the others are just out there. There's a lot of wonderful lyrics. I was able to record Jupiter with my dad playing bass. It came out on the Midnight North record that we put out like a year and a half ago.
I wanna do what I think I should. Carve my coffin out of juniper wood and build my house of sticks and sand. When it falls, I won't give a damn.
That's on Midnight North's 2023 album Diamonds in the Zodiac, which takes its title from one of Hunter's lyrics. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast. But as much time as we spent exploring the first half of Phil Lesh's musical life, we're really going to have to give the short end of the stick to the second half. Even the unflappable Gary Lambert is flapped when trying to conceive of highlights.
It was Phil, very inadvertent. It had those origins in first just some benefit shows for the Unbroken Chain Foundation. Phil discovering that there were a lot of musicians who were playing this music with the help of David Gans, and he just got turned on to playing it again without all the infrastructure of the Grateful Dead. I think that was an important part of the appeal for him. You know, he could schedule gigs fairly spontaneously. He could pick out a random collection of friends, or sometimes it was Phil Lesh and strangers. Sometimes it was Phil Lesh and people he was meeting on stage for the first time when they sound checked. And he really liked that random aspect of it, the malleability of it, the fact that any combination of musicians could sound different from any other combination. And that sort of became his aesthetic.
Many of Phil's friends were drawn from disparate musical worlds, inviting in jazz players especially.
I invite these guys to play with me because they're not part of the so-called jam band Grateful Dead scene, because I want to get that different perspective on the music from these musicians. And so what I do is I send them lists of songs, and I send them CDs of various versions of the songs, and so they can sort of listen to them, get them into their subconscious, their etheric, as we like to say. And then we rehearse a little, and I try to get the concept across that what I'm looking for is a conversation between all the musicians in the band, so that when we're improvising, we're all improvising at the same time. We're all feeding off one another.
With his various configurations of friends, Phil was able to try things he was never able to do with the Dead. Mike Gordon.
And Phil, when we used to tour them, when we toured with them in 06 with me and Trey and the duo, it was interesting to see how they were handling that jam in 15, because they weren't just making it 15. They were also, Phil would interpret it in different ways. Like, let's pretend it's some other, like 13 for a while, and then circle back around and just toying with it, seeing what it could become in different ways.
Phil even got some of his old basses back into action, including Big Brown.
I've forgotten how stiff the action was and everything. I haven't gotten around to making any changes with that, lowering the action or anything. But the sound of it is just amazing. It's louder than anything I've played since. The thing is that I've got all those knobs on it, those tone controls on it that allows me to do feedback in a way that I can't with my current instrument. So I use it for feedback and for color, really. We just did some last night. I just used it last night. The thing that stuck with me is that now I want to have those same guys make me another instrument.
Then once he got Terrapin Crossroads up and running, it was just like the greatest little playhouse in the world. You know, we can try anything here.
In 2011, Phil and his wife Jill opened Terrapin Crossroads in San Rafael, a few blocks from the Dead's former Front Street headquarters, where countless Phil and Friends lineups congregated, and the bar owner anchored the Terrapin family band with his son Grahame and other musicians. And of course, Phil periodically reunited with various configurations of former Grateful Deads, including the Fare Thee Well shows in 2015.
Something like a bird with an inside. Oh, I know she sang a little while and then grew up. Tell me all that you know. Storm and rain.
After Terrapin Crossroads closed in 2021, in 2024, Phil convened the Terrapin Clubhouse, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast, for a beautifully improvised cap to a beautifully improvised career. Grahame Lesh.
My brother had this studio space, this warehouse space that he was using as an office and a studio. And then he was going to sort of get rid of it. We had storage stuff there. We had family stuff. It was just such a cool space. And so my mom and dad were like, why don't we do something multimedia? It's kind of an extension of the Terrapin Crossroads idea, of the Levon Helm Studios idea of let the people come to you. So my dad wouldn't have to travel and tour as much. Anytime some of the friends would be in town, we'd put together a band and just turn on the cameras and see what happened.
Gary Lambert.
Phil's natural impulse as a teacher, like sitting around and talking about Dark Star with those younger musicians, them hanging on his every word. It was like an object lesson in the process of collective improvisation. Each young musician like Daniel Donato could energize it in one way. I think the last one they did was with Michaela Davis on harp. And there's a moment where they're playing Mountains of the Moon. And Michaela is playing that exquisite harp on Mountains of the Moon. And there was a shot like through the harp of Phil, like in the background, just beaming, beaming with delight, because that was, like maybe that was the way he'd heard it in his head for years. I've talked to a bunch of those musicians who had that experience of playing with them, and utterly life-altering for them.
We called it the Dark Star-thon, the never-ending Dark Star. It's just an excuse to jam and just be open and open-minded with the whole thing.
Dark Star is always playing somewhere, Phil Lesh once said. Wherever that is, that's where Phil is too.
Thanks very much for tuning in to the good old Grateful Deadcast, friends. We'd like to thank our guests in this episode, Grahame Lesh, Mike Gordon, Ned Lagin, David Crosby, David Lemieux, Gary Lambert, and Rob Collier. Extra special thanks to friend of the Deadcast, as always, David Gantz. Thank you for your ongoing contributions of audio from your interview archive. Executive producer for the good old Grateful Deadcast, Mark Pincus. Produced for Rhino Entertainment by Rich Mahan Promotions and Jesse Jarno. Special thanks to David Lemieux, Brian Dodd, and Doran Tyson. All rights reserved.